So, this is like the epilogue of the 30 Years War series from Kings and Generals that we've already covered. I'll treat this as the epilogue, and I'm assuming this video is going to mainly be talking about, or more in-depth look, rather, into the devastation in both, the land and the people, during the 30 Years War. And yeah, Kings and Generals did mention it oftentimes, with the rating and the death toll, but I'm imagining this is going to be a more in-depth look at that, which is what I'm really looking most forward to. So yeah, overall I'm looking forward to this, and overall I just need to kind of say that I love the 30 Years War. Like I said, I went into this not knowing anything about this conflict, any of the people involved, even the outcome. And I ended up being so amazed, and this is why I love just Kings and Generals and history in general. Just like, I love that this channel is just me learning and having fun, because history has always been my favorite subject. And I like that I'm able to just sit down and just enjoy history and learn from it, and learn from these guys like Kings and Generals. Like, this really is just... I'm enjoying this so much. But yeah, I just wanted to give quick praise to Kings and Generals, who is my favorite historical YouTuber. Alright, without any further ado, we should probably get into this, huh?
War brings death and destruction to everyone who's involved in it, from soldiers in the armies to sailors and merchants. Nevertheless, it is the civilian population that suffers the most. This is especially true for the 30 Years' War. Although the effect that the war had on religion, warfare and politics are thoroughly covered, its effects on the general populace are often overlooked. This is even more surprising considering the fact that millions of people died, and that the Holy Roman Empire lost between a quarter and a third of its population, with some areas having lost more than half. A variety of factors contributed to the devastation, and we will discuss them in this video. But before we jump to the video, as the 30 Years...
Yeah, I feel like you could say that a lot about conflicts. I've been mentioning it. I feel like I've been mentioning it a bit more often in these videos, but I just feel bad for the everyday person. Like, yeah, we're covering the big political leaders, the kings and the generals and, all that, and the soldiers and the armies and the tactics, but then you, kind of forget just about the places they're looting, the villages and towns they're burning and sackings, and the sieges. It's just awful being a normal person in this, Like, I keep saying, but you can just be chilling in your town, you can be chilling in your village, and then a random army will show up and, kill you, or rape you, or, burn everything down, and you can be in a town just minding your own business, and then you're suddenly besieged, and if the besiegers get in, they just massacre everyone. It's just this is most of human history, by the way, with war, but that's why it just sucks to just be a normal person minding your own business, because you're not safe. So, I don't know. I just feel bad for the everyday person. All those millions that die were probably just average people. I mean, soldiers are also average people, but I just mean, of the general population not involved, just kind of, just minding their own business in their towns and villages. It's just, they didn't deserve it, but that's just the sad reality of war, right? War. It never changes. But, yeah, I don't know, I just kind of feel bad.
War lasted for 3 decades between 1618 and 1648. The fighting varied in intensity and scope depending on the region and the year in question. During the initial phase of the war, the action was concentrated along the Danube, Upper Hungary, Bohemia and Moravia. Although all of the horrors of the war are largely associated with the final phase of the conflict, they were already present in the beginning. Plunder, plague, and the murder of civilians were widespread in the affected areas. Bohemia also saw an additional loss of population, as all non-Catholics who refused to convert were forced to leave. Following the Battle of White Mountain and the pacification of Bohemia, war operations continued in the territories of the Palatinate and in Lower Saxony. It is at this point that Frederick V decided to employ the services of Ernst von Mansfeld, a mercenary leader. While serving under Frederick, Mansfeld's mercenaries plundered Alsace and Hesse. Not limiting themselves to the territories of their enemies, the mercenaries also ravaged the lands that they were supposed to protect. Mansfeld proved to be a shrewd leader.
Yeah, we did notice the idea. We noticed in this series a lot of mercenary companies were hired, and mercenaries have their place in war, in all eras of war. But especially this war in particular, like I did notice the rise of mercenaries and just how prevalent they were in this conflict. And again, they were only loyal, fighting for money. Like, yeah, that's a big thing. And he mentioned that armies at this time, kings and generals mentioned, they needed to kind of supply themselves. So that already is bad enough, or like fund themselves, I think he said. He said one of those two. Either way, that forced them to just go around gathering more supplies at the expense of random people. Like, it's awful, man.
After leaving Frederick's service, he subsequently entered the service of Christian of Brunswick and ravaged Lorraine, the United Provinces, and East Frisia while campaigning for his new employer. On paper, mercenaries seemed expensive to hire and maintain, and not many rulers would have the resources to hire them. However, they turned out to be one of the main causes of suffering and devastation during the war. The Protestants were on the cusp of defeat after the Battle of Stadtlohn. The possibility of a complete change in the religious balance in Central Europe worried King Christian IV of Denmark, and he would enter the war in 1625. Seeing this as a serious threat, the Emperor asked Albrecht von Wallenstein for military assistance. The ever-ambitious Wallenstein, not satisfied with the gains that he had made during the Bohemian campaign, agreed to help only if he was allowed to plunder the territories that he would capture.
Oh wow.
Wallenstein's army ravaged Lower Saxony for much of late 1625 and 1626. The Danish were soundly defeated by both Thiel and Wallenstein. However, Wallenstein's insatiable ambition also led him to want a Baltic Sea port. To that end, he sought to capture Stralsund, and on the way to the city, his forces pillaged Mecklenburg and Pomerania. Besides the mercenaries, another important factor was the forces of the Catholic and Protestant leagues. These armies were indeed easier to finance than mercenaries.
Yeah, wait, let me get that again. But I wanted to quickly comment, yeah, we've seen mercenaries pop up in this channel, and oftentimes cause chaos in their own way, especially due to just the upkeep of them. Like, if they don't get what they want, they easily become such a great threat to you, and just go off and do whatever they want. I think the most, like, best example of this when we covered the Mikhail the Brave series by History March. Just like all his mercenaries, he kind of just let go, and then they just went around conquering stuff on their own and being a mess. And again, like, mercenaries can be obviously, excuse me. So if you're like low on manpower, they are a great solution, and if you have enough cash. But, like, also, it's just, like, they can easily become quite the problem, right? If they're not satiated. So, I don't know. Like, again, they have their place in war, but we've seen times in history where they can just be the biggest menaces around, right?
Mercenaries. Another important factor was the forces of the Catholic and Protestant leagues. These armies were indeed easier to finance than mercenaries, and in any ordinary war that would not have been a major problem. For the first few years of the 30 Years' War, it was not a problem either, but as time passed and the economies of the realms involved in the wars began to diminish, so did their ability to pay the soldiers.
Yeah, armies in general are expensive, especially in war. You know, you often hear about how kingdoms and empires needed to, like, raise taxes or do stuff to just keep their armies around or to fund new armies. this war was 30 years of non-stop fighting. Like, the amount of money you needed just to keep this up, especially the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were the ones fighting from the very beginning until the end. Like, I was amazed by not only their manpower, considering how ravaged the Holy Roman Empire was during the war, but also their economy, because they can still keep raising armies. Like, I was, like, impressed by the Habsburgs, and the Holy Roman Empire, because I'm like, how are you still funding, how do you still have money and manpower after 30 years of non-stop fighting? But, yeah.
Of the Danish involvement in 1630. The states involved in the war could only finance the recruitment and equipment of their new soldiers. Meanwhile, the soldiers' salaries and supplying the armies fell upon the civilians of the regions where the armies were.
Ooh, yeah.
During the 1620s, armies frequently relied upon so-called contributions, when either the governors of the affected areas would pay a certain amount of money, or the army itself would extort funds from the civilians in an organized manner.
Yeah, essentially becoming like freaking mobsters, right? Like, I've heard that before, like, where it's like, you need to pay us for protection. Essentially running like a racket, I think it's what it's called. Or like what mobsters do, it feels like, oh, we're protecting you, give us money or something like that. Or in this case, probably more forcefully, give us money or else, It's like, I'm telling you, the everyday person never had a chance. Like, you'll just get bullied into giving money.
At times, the amount of money that the armies demanded was extraordinary, forcing the people to sell their stores of grain, wine, and other essentials in desperate attempts to satisfy mounting demands. The only two countries which were able to both pay and supply their soldiers for the entirety of the war were Spain and the United Provinces. Therefore, it should be no wonder that the population of the Spanish and Dutch Netherlands escaped relatively unharmed from the war. The troops, of course, were suffering from a constant lack of supplies as well. As a result, they frequently took whatever the civilians had left in their stores. Production also declined as seed corn was consumed, and vital assets like tools or mills were destroyed. The majority of the trade routes in the Holy Roman Empire were affected, and trade ground to a halt. There were no alternative ways for people to acquire food. This left many areas of the empire with famine, and many people simply starved to death.
That's awful.
The Swedish landing in Pomerania in 1630
When you write, your tone
initially did not change this pattern. Active operations resumed after a year's lull, but remained constant in Pomerania and Mecklenburg. Imperial and Catholic League units were withdrawn from other parts of Germany, either to confront the Swedes or to join the siege of Mantua. This much-needed respite for the people of the empire, along with the great harvests of 1630 and 1631, cushioned the rising troop numbers for a time. The full effects were delayed until the Swedish exploitation of their victory at Breitenfeld rapidly spread the war into all parts of Germany by 1632. Total troop numbers reached an unprecedented 250,000, thanks to the new regional armies formed in Westphalia, Lower Saxony, the Upper Rhine, and Swabia, as well as the main forces campaigning in Bavaria, Franconia, and Electoral Saxony. The poor maintenance of the Imperial and Catholic League armies was quite evident by this point. Following the siege of Magdeburg in 1631, the ill-disciplined, hungry, and unpaid army led by Thiel sacked the city. The city was almost completely burned down, and widespread looting, rape, and murder occurred. Of the 25,000 inhabitants of the city at the beginning of the siege, between 20,000 and 24,000 were dead, unfed and unpaid.
Dude, my goodness, man, that's so awful. Like, I'm telling you, I don't know how, we've seen this a lot in this channel's history, but it's still just, sad, you know what I mean? Just to continually see that. It's sad, but it's such a common thing in war, you know? That's why, like, you know, war's an ugly thing at the end of the day. I know we have fun kind of looking at these tactics and battles and whatnot, but, you know, that doesn't mean that I condone it. Like, I think everyone sees that war is an ugly thing that brings nothing but suffering, you know? And this is, like, a good example of it, like, looking in depth, just, man.
Soldiers proved difficult to control, even for a commander of Teal's caliber, and he was only able to stop the sacking after 4 days. The ravaging of large walled cities was still an exception to the rule rather than the rule itself. Other than the sack of Magdeburg, large cities were quite rarely ravaged by armies, as they proved invaluable to each side. On the other hand, the people of smaller towns and the countryside bore the brunt of the war, with many of them ending up as refugees in those larger cities. Gustavus Adolphus famously remarked, "War will pay for war," indicating that mobility was crucial for an army's survival, as staying for too long in one place would lead to starvation. The Scottish mercenary captain Robert Monroe mentions in his memoirs that Gustavus Adolphus sympathized with the civilian population and wished to lessen the burden on them as much as he could. As starved soldiers were prone to take their frustrations out on the general populace, the Swedish king ensured that his army was paid a regular salary and that it would be supplied regularly. As bad as the
That's very nice of Gustavus. I'm liking the guy more and more, you know, I was really impressed by him, as I think he's also known as like the father of modern warfare, or at least of his time. Obviously war has evolved a lot, but you know, I was really impressed by him and very shocked when he died when he did, very suddenly and out of nowhere. But that's a really nice thing, you know, it's kind of cool to see, because usually with the higher ups, the kings and whatnot, you kind of become, we don't really get the impression that they care a lot about the little guy, you know what I mean? Kind of like, they're doing their own thing, they need their armies, they're waging their wars for their own purposes, you know, do what they do. It's kind of cool to see that he kind of cared, you know, which is, I guess, which sounds like the bare minimum, but at this point, it's a big thing, you know? So that's nice, you know? He at least cared enough to try to do something. I don't know, that was a nice moment. I have to say, I'm liking the guy even more now because of hearing that.
situation was for the civilian population. After the death of Gustavus Adolphus, things only became worse. The commanders who took charge of the Swedish armies were far less concerned with the well-being of the commoners than their late king. Moreover, the soldiers were also rarely paid, as the commanders kept the money for themselves, and also suffered from food shortages.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, the commanders of the Swedish after the war still were competent and did their part, you know, and gained their victories, but obviously things weren't the same after Gustavus's, and we could see it there. We even saw straight up a mutiny in one of the videos we watched in the series, where the Swedish soldiers were like, we want to get paid, and they just didn't go relieve, like, a siege or something. Yeah.
Much like in future wars, the Swedish army was forced to live off the land, leaving peasants with very little food, if any at all. Though sources offer diverging numbers, they all agree that the Swedes were responsible for the destruction of thousands of villages, towns, and other smaller settlements. The years from 1632 to 1640 are considered to be the deadliest period of the war. This coincides with the death of the Swedish king, along with the beginning of French operations within the Holy Roman Empire. The three armies were exhausted from years of constant warfare. All semblance of order broke down, and the armies ravaged the countryside in the areas where they were stationed. In comparison to this brutal and indiscriminate raiding, the contributions of the 1620s seemed rather benign at this point. The historian Ronald G. Ashe mentions that, quite paradoxically, the civilians were also responsible for each other's suffering during the 1630s. As armies raided, they took everything of value from each household, only to later sell it in the neighbouring town for a tenth of its real price, or exchange it for food. In addition, due to the constant marauding of the armies, many peasants resorted to banditry or formed militias, attacking civilians and soldiers alike. The Imperial Army was especially under pressure.
Yeah, that's insane. It's kind of like just shows how chaotic things came. Especially, it keeps getting worse. More armies keep appearing, more people show up. It just keeps getting worse. You know what I mean? And I don't know what else to say. In all honesty, I'm happy we watch videos like this sometimes, because it's good to be reminded of just like how brutal history can be, you know, especially if we're just average Joes, kind of like us here. You know what I mean? Like, things would not have been kind to us back then. Like, you know, life can be hard. I'm not saying nowadays, it can definitely be hard nowadays, but I am happier to be living now than back then, in earlier points of history. You know what I mean? Because, like I said, just a random empire kingdom can just invade you any minute. And, yeah, just suffering from then on out, I don't know. I am happier nowadays. Though I'm not saying everything's perfect now, I'm happier now than living now than back then.
As it now faced two very formidable foes. Desperate, they began employing scorched earth tactics to make sure that the opposing armies would find absolutely nothing of use in involved areas. The quick Swedish retreat from southern Germany left the Protestant provinces there vulnerable. As the imperial armies took Württemberg, their treatment of the population and their desire to leave nothing for the Swedish army led to severe depopulation, with some estimates ranging to even 69% of the population.
Oh my gosh. Like I said, by the end, I'm surprised the Holy Roman Empire, like, after all that destruction, I'm like, how do you rebound? how do you, like, how were they still funding armies? Like, it's insane, right? Man.
The Swedish and French armies, themselves not in an envious position, followed suit and started using scorched earth tactics too. However, their involvement in the war brought respite to some areas. As the lands west of the Rhine were under French control much of the time, they had a chance to recover after 1636. The Habsburg monarchy also saw some peaceful years, and the majority of northern Germany also went through recovery before the Swedish invasion of Denmark in 1643. Until the end of the war, the only areas that were significantly affected were the areas with a large military presence. Southern Germany was severely devastated, as that is where the Bavarians and French frequently fought. Bohemia and Moravia, after nearly 20 years of relative peace, once again became a battleground after the Swedes invaded. The population of Pomerania and Brandenburg, although not affected by war directly, was subjected to the cruelty of the Swedish garrisons which were posted there for prolonged periods of time.
Yeah, he mentioned in the series about how people would have rather fallen to anyone else's hands than the Swedish. I think it was Prong or something, or it was one of the later videos where the Swedish were trying to relieve somewhere, and they were like trying to portray themselves as liberators or something like that. But then like the populace said, heck no, we would rather be under anyone else's rule. And I'm starting to get the impression why. Because like, yes, the Swedish army great in the battle, but their conduct so far, it seems, especially outside of Gustavus, was not good at all. And like, you could see why normal people we'd rather be under anyone else's rule than the Swedish at this point, because the Swedish army was brutal. You know, I play this game called Mount & Blade Warband. I've been playing since, I think, 2012 2019-ish. It's the only video game I play now. I don't even play like video games anymore. But I still play that one video game on my PS4 behind me. Well, you can't see it because I have a green screen. But yeah, and I always play it. Like I always have fun replaying it. I always play with different strategies, tactics. It's a game I never get tired of, and I'm even playing it nowadays. I literally was playing it yesterday, and like, oftentimes when I start my own kingdoms, like, I end up, like, leading my armies through war, and sometimes I'm unable to secure peace with the other countries, so oftentimes I'm fighting against 6 kingdoms while my newly fledged kingdom is new, and I mainly focus on going around conquering like towns and castles. My villages are always left undefended and they're always burning. Like I'll be marching somewhere and I'm getting like 10 notifications. Villages looted, villages looted. It's just, and my map, I'm looking, like, all my villages are burning, but I'm just more concerned about gathering more towns and castles. So I kind of become unsympathetic. There's only one playthrough where I actually cared a lot about my villages and towns. And, like, I would constantly rush to defend them, but that took a lot of time. In a lot of my other playthroughs, I'm just going off on the mission, and my general populace is suffering, especially since the war never ends. Even I was getting war wearied as I was playing yesterday, and I've been stuck in this war for like hundreds of days, and even I'm like just jumping back and forth, fighting the same armies back to back, and I was even starting to get war weariness in a video game. I'm sorry, I always want to talk about Mount and Blade Warband because it's my favorite game. It's the only video game I ever play nowadays. And that I've been playing consistently for the past, like, 5 years or so. So, yeah, I don't know. That's probably the closest I could get to experience something like this. And again, it's a video game. I don't want to equate my gaming with the actual suffering of real people. It's just that's the closest I can get to, like, kind of relating. Also, I thought it'd be kind of funny and fun to share. But, yeah, I'm an awful king. At least to the everyday man, my poor villages.
Although it is widely known that armies also decreased in size during this time, that proved to be a misconception, as the number of troops that each state fielded during the war gradually increased until 1648. Another effect which the war had on the Holy Roman Empire was of an ecological nature. There was an explosion in the rodent population during 1636 that lasted several years and exacerbated the food shortage. Wolves roamed southwestern Bavaria during 1638, returning in the early 1640s, while packs of wild pigs destroyed crops in 1639. Other animals disappeared as they became alternative sources of food. A Bavarian soldier marching along the Lower Rhine in February 1636 recorded that there was neither cat nor dog, while there are numerous accounts of urban populations.
That's sad. As a dog, owner myself, it's sad too. I always get sad when I hear about the death of dogs, but like, again, desperate times call for desperate measures. But it's still sad. It still breaks my heart.
Consuming both types of animals during the hunger years of the 1630s. Prolonged war, as always, also brought disease. Soldiers from various parts of Europe brought unfamiliar microbes with them to the empire. The civilian population, often starving, was susceptible to the various diseases that engulfed the lands. For example, Wallenstein's campaign down the Elbe brought the plague to those areas, and northern Italy also suffered from a bubonic plague epidemic after the Mantuan War. Scores of refugees crowding into large...
sometimes I think about some of the worst fictional, like, realities in history. Like, I also often see, like, people talk about how certain, like, fictional worlds are the worst to live in. And like, they'll break down, like, statistics of stuff. Like, kind of like think of Attack on Titan, for example. And then I think about, like, our world, and, like, our real-life history and world can kind of exceed the violence and the death of even some of the worst fictional worlds, you know? Sometimes it really is real life Warhammer 4K or whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Is it called 4K? Wait, I want to get that right. I've never played the game, but Warhammer. Okay, I said 4K, it's 40K. My apologies. I've actually never played the game, but I've heard of the lore of it and how brutal it can be. So I'm like, I don't know. But yeah, sometimes our real life can exceed even the worst fictional realities for people. And you gotta think of like people who are like in the midst of this, like it's literally hell on earth. Like their life is knowing nothing but suffering and pain. When I put that in perspective, I'm like, we're pretty fortunate, right, guys? Here, like I feel like we're much more fortunate than the people of the past, which makes me more grateful, but also just sad, you know? Some people just grew up, knew nothing but war and suffering, and died in that, you know what I mean? And it's, in fact, millions, billions, if you count all of human history, and it's sad. It makes me more happy to be living in our age, you know? And more thankful for what we have.
Old cities only exacerbated the spread of disease, both by contributing to the famine and by contagion. Furthermore, the aforementioned proliferation of rodent populations only made things worse for the cities which were overflowing with people.
Find what you love.
Though most sources only mention the plague, it is quite possible that dysentery and typhus caused many deaths too, as they became endemic to Germany in the final years of the war. By sheer numbers of casualties, the war was, quite possibly, the deadliest war in Europe until then. Total deaths in the Empire may have surpassed 8 million, given the relatively high number of military casualties, and the fact that the true extent of civilian losses is often masked by the presence of wartime births recorded in overall population tolls. However, if we take into account the percentage of population loss, this war remains the most destructive war in European history. By comparison, the Soviet Union, which suffered the heaviest casualties of the Second World War, lost less than 12% of its population. Both 20th century world wars were of course briefer, with the casualties each year correspondingly higher. Nonetheless, around 20 million of those lost during the First World War were due to the influenza outbreak at its end. A significant portion of the victims of the Second World War were killed in deliberate genocide, a feature mercifully absent from the 30 Years' War that was also waged with much less potent weaponry. The population of the empire...
Yeah, again, I before I started this series, I also had heard about some of the most wild things about the 30 Years' War, how it, at least in Germany, like population death rivaled or exceeded World War I and II, or like the overall death count was even like enough to rival those wars, which is just insane, you know?
Empire recovered slowly over the following decades. However, the most profound effect that the war had was that it created a sense of unity within the German nation. With the people spending most of their lifetime at war, and 2 generations completely lost to warfare, there was still a silver lining in all of this. The survivors were left with a significantly higher standard of living, much like the English peasants after the Black Death. With the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the 30 Years' War had finally ended. One of the most brutal and devastating conflicts that Europe had seen was over, and the civilians of the Holy Roman Empire could breathe a sigh of relief. We will continue talking about the 30 Years' War and other conflicts, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed...
Oh snap, wait, crap. Snap, crackle, pop. Okay, so that was another great video, guys, and I'm glad we watched these videos, because like I said, we have a lot of fun, you know, watching these great commanders and these generals and the battles, like, yeah, this is so cool, but at the same time, it's good to, like, get the reality shot every now and then about the, just how awful the war actually is, and to remember not to glorify it. So overall, yeah.